Okay, folks, we're going to get started. My name is Pete Quagliarello, and I am a managing consultant with Acceleres, and we specialize in System Center Service Manager 2012 and Orchestrator 2012. And I'm pleased to be with you today. I'm joined by a colleague of mine, Nick Totillo, and we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about service level management in Service Manager 2012. We're going to take you through, we're going to give you an overview of the functionality, the service level management functionality in Service Manager 2012, kind of give you an idea of the building blocks of service level management, try to give you some ideas, try to give you an idea what the possibilities are for creating SLOs in Service Manager 2012. If you've got some familiarity with Service Manager 2010 or you're using Service Manager 2010, the service level management functionality in the 2012 version of the product has taken a very big step forward, and it really lets you do a lot of things that you couldn't previously do in Service Manager 2010. So with that, let me just confirm we're going to take you through service level management in both versions of the product, 2010 and 2012, so that for those of you who are familiar with the 2010 version, you'll know the difference. We're going to look into the service level objective in Service Manager 2012, which is really the key part of service level management. And we'll also cover setting up these SLOs and then glance ahead to some of the possibilities as well as some considerations, some things that you should keep in mind if you're thinking about implementing these SLOs in your environment. And of course, we'll be happy to take questions at the very end. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Nick Totillo, who's going to join me. Nick?
Hi guys, my name is Nicholas Totillo. I'm a technical consultant focused primarily on Service Manager.
Great. So let's get into it then and talk about service level management in Service Manager 2010. And again, this is really just going to be relevant to anybody who's using or has seen Service Manager 2010. We didn't, frankly, have a lot of true service level management functionality in Service Manager 2010. We could basically, on the incident, set the time to resolve. It was priority-based, ran on a 24/7 calendar, and we didn't have any opportunity to set the status of an SLO. So it was somewhat limited, and I know a number of our customers who used it, they were able to use it, but it was somewhat frustrating to them to only have the 24/7 calendar, to only have it be priority-based. They would have very routine incidents that would be opened at the end of a week that would breach over a weekend, and that caused them some problems, specifically in reporting. So what we gain in Service Manager 2012 with SLOs is we gain the ability to have service level management both on the incident and on the new service request work item. And we also gain, instead of just the 24/7 calendar, we gain multiple configurable calendars. So we can still have a 24/7 calendar, but most importantly, we can now have business hour calendars where we can set working and non-working times. So we can exclude weekends and we can exclude holidays, which is nice functionality to have. We also gain metrics. So whereas we used to only have time to resolve, we still have that, but we can also measure time to respond, time to first assign, and we can also, in fact, create other custom metrics based on date properties, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. And then we do gain a status. We have out-of-the-box statuses for active, met, for warning and breached. There is a pause status available, but they haven't yet made the ability to pause an SLO native in the application, and I suspect that's something that will come in the future. So I just want to go through the building blocks of the service level objective. This is, again, new in Service Manager 2012. We did not have this before. And it's got three key parts. The first of which, and we touched on a minute ago, is the calendar. So this is, as I had mentioned, going to set the working and the non-working times within the SLO. And as I said before, we can still have a 24/7 calendar, but now we have the ability to set our business hours, which gives us a lot of flexibility. And we can have multiple calendars, so we could have multiple business hour calendars. And we'll maybe give you an idea of how you might use multiple calendars a little bit later on in the presentation. So the second component that we have is the metrics. So this is, what are we measuring here? And these are all time-based metrics. We're going to get, for an incident, we're going to get resolve time or resolution time out of the box, but we also now gain the ability to measure response time. And this is going to allow us to have multiple SLOs within the same work and within one incident or within one service request. And again, from experience, we've had a number of customers who've wanted this. They've had SLOs for both response and for resolution on an incident, and now we can accommodate that because we can have multiple metrics. And as I had mentioned before, we can set other metrics if we want. First assign, time to first assign is another metric. And if we had a custom date property that we might add to the incident or to the service request, we'd have the opportunity to use that. What we're basically doing, and again, we'll get to this in a couple of slides, is we're basically just picking intervals between date properties in Service Manager. And then next we've got queues, and for those of you who know Service Manager, you know that the queue was in Service Manager 2010. I'm not sure that a lot of folks ended up using queues, and I can tell you that you'll definitely use queues if you're going to be using SLOs in Service Manager 2012. And this is basically going to allow us to determine the work items to which our SLO is going to be applied. We're just simply going to set up criteria. So examples that I've included here, like priority 1 incidents or service requests for UK users. Really just about any criteria we can set in a queue we can use so that we can constrain exactly what we're applying that SLO to. So all of that then rolls into the SLO itself. We get the combination of the calendar, we get the combination of the metric, we get the queue that tells us what do we apply this to, and basically the SLO then adds a target. So if we had, for example, time to respond, we could say we're going to use standard business hours, the metric will be time to respond, we're going to apply that to service requests for UK users, and our target is going to be 1 hour. And we can also set a threshold, a warning threshold, and we might say that the warning threshold is, say, a half hour. Some of this is going to be a little bit clearer to you in upcoming slides where we're going to show you some screenshots. So that, those are the kind of the basic building blocks of the SLO. And it's pretty straightforward, I think. So Nick, why don't you talk about actually setting these up in Service Manager?
Yeah, no problem, Pete. So typically, we'll start with setting up the queues, the little screenshot snippet you see, I'll highlight it here. That's sort of where we start with this, and that's because we want to group our work items into the different buckets that we're going to apply the service level to. Creating the, sorry, just bear with me for 1 second here. And then, so we'll start with creating the queues, and then we'll look at calendars, metrics, and service levels. I'm going to start with looking at the calendar here, though, since that's what we've got up for the screenshot. So for creating a calendar, it's very, very straightforward. There's a couple things I'd like to call out here, though. So you just give it a title, you specify the time zone that this calendar will apply to. That's another advantage of the service level functionality in Service Manager is we can track our targets based on different time zones. And that can apply to either the location of the analysts or the location of the end users. that decision's up to you which time zone gets applied if the supporting analysts are located in a different time zone than the people they're supporting. We very simply just specify each day that there's going to be business hours, and then we specify the start time and the end time, and there's a place there to set all of the holidays. And you can imagine, we've got standard business hours US here. We could have standard business hours in other locations that have different holidays, like Canada or in Europe, for instance. A couple of points on this side. We called this out later as well. In order to set up a 24/7 calendar, you just check off each of the days, and your start time will be midnight, and your end time will be 11:59:59. There is no 24-hour button. You just set it up that way. And also, we've seen a few folks who have had extended service desk hours where they've worked from, say, 9 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the morning. And for situations like that, what we've had to do is adjust the time zone in order to meet that requirement. So if your business hours were 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. Eastern Time, we would set the business hours to something like 7 a.m. to midnight Mountain Time. And the end result is exactly the same. But since we can only go to the end of one day, we just have to adjust the time zone a bit in order to account for that. And this is invisible to both users of the system. It's also invisible to end users. It's really just set up to help us get to the actual targets that we're looking for. All right. So once we've got that, we look at setting up the metric. And the metric, like Pete said, is really just a combination or a difference between any two date properties in the system. Oftentimes our start date is going to be created date, and then our end dates vary, either first response or assign date, or the resolution date or completion date. So we're really just measuring the difference between these two date properties. We don't specify the targets, though, in the metric, and that's an advantage because we can use the same metric then in different service level objectives and just change the target. So for instance, first response date might have very different targets depending on the priority of the incident, but we only need to set the metric up once. We specify the target later. The next configuration then will be the queue. This is typically where I think of first. I think of what are the groups of work items that we're going to apply these to. Then I start thinking about so what business hour calendar applies to these, and then what metrics do we want to measure within that. So a queue is just a group of work items based on some criteria. You can see some example queues that we've got here for incidents. So we've got a queue of priority 1 incidents, and then priority 1 incidents where the affected users in Canada or in the United States. And you can build to a great deal of flexibility here in terms of what criteria you use. And like Pete said earlier, once we've got those three things, once we've got the calendar, the metric, and the queue, we roll all of that up together in the service level criteria and the service level objective. And we just put those three things together. We tell it what queue we want to apply this to. We tell it what calendar we're going to use, what metric we want to measure, and this is where we specify our target and our threshold. So in the service level objective itself, we're really just rolling up all of the other three configurations together and specifying our targets. Pete, can you go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. Once that's been done, and our configurations are ready, they'll start applying to new work items, to new incidents and service requests. And you can see here how that gets exposed to end users, how people consume that information once it's been configured. And there's a couple of different ways. You can see this information in views. There's a few views available out of the box, like the assigned to me view, like the incidents with service levels breached view. However, in custom views, we have to do some work inside the XML of the management pack in order to make these icons appear and these target dates appear. So we do some work in order to get these into most of the custom views we build as well, because it's valuable information And a view tends to be one of the best ways to sort of consume that information because you can sort on these and get to the stuff that's due the earliest. We can sort by that icon and get the stuff that's already breached. But you can see kind of the indicators that it gives you from a view perspective. But do keep in mind that that's a little bit of additional work beyond what it takes to normally build a custom view within the console, because we do have to export it out and then do some work in the XML. But it's fairly straightforward for anyone who's used to working with management packs. It's fairly straightforward for us.
And I did want to mention, Nick, that the this column, we did add that. I believe that column does appear as part of the incident class when you're building a view, but I don't believe it's going to populate with any data. So again, we didn't just use that column in the view. We actually went in, as Nick said, into the XML to create this. Another challenge that we have in a view is that there can be, as we looked at a little bit earlier, a one-to-many view. One-to-many relationship between the incident and SLOs. You might have multiple SLOs for one incident, and we're only going to be able to show one target end date here. And unfortunately, I didn't think to get it in the screenshot, but one of the things that we have working for us here in cases where we do have multiple SLOs is if you hover over this icon, it will show you the SLOs. It'll give you a little bit of detail on the SLO, the name of the SLO, the target end date. The status is obvious here, at least of one of the SLOs. At least one of them is breached. But I guess what I'm saying is you do have a little bit of limitation with respect to what you can display in a view because of that one-to-many relationship.
That's right, and I think it'll always default to just showing you the next target. Right, it's always going to be the next target. I don't think it picks randomly. I think it's the next nearest one. And then, of course, once we've got a form open, so here's a screenshot of the banner of an incident form. We can see some information here. We can see the target end date, and we can see the icon on the service level objective, as well as this yellow notification bar at the top letting us know that some things have breached. This target end date in Service Manager 2010 was called the resolved by date. And that's legacy functionality. There's this spot in the incident settings. There's a checkbox that you can check that will replace the legacy resolve date with the new service level objective target end date. So you can have and this date property works very, very similarly to the view here. It'll show you the next due date for the incident.
Yeah, this is just the detail that you're going to see, and again, this is an example of an SLO that happens to have, or rather an incident that happens to have two SLOs, one for resolve, one for respond. We don't have a shot of it, but you would actually get a green icon in here that says met if indeed one of the SLOs was met. And there's also a warning, a yellow warning icon that will appear once the SLO reaches that warning threshold. So again, we've given you kind of a broad brush and a very, very quick walkthrough of how the SLO is configured. And now we just want to talk about, so what can you do with this? What does this mean? You now have some flexibility that you didn't have before. You can certainly do what, and I think this is what most organizations want to do anyway, which is to have priority-based SLOs. So for example, we could have our priority 1 incidents run on a 24/7 calendar, but we could keep our lower priority incidents running on business hour calendars. And that's a pretty common scenario. That's what we see a lot of customers wanting to do. But you know, we're not limited anymore to just basing our SLOs on priority. We can now make them user-based, and I think Nick had touched on that earlier, the idea that we can now have different SLOs based on, say, the office or country property for the end user. So if we wanted to have, as we illustrated in some of the screenshots before, different SLOs for U.S. users versus Canadian users, we could do that, even if that was simply just to be able to distinguish different working times. One thing that we've run across on occasion is that a resolver team, a support group, might be a vendor, and you might have a specific SLO for that vendor. This is another thing that this enhanced SLO functionality brings to you, is the ability now to set a unique SLO for that team. So maybe that team, when they have something assigned to them, they have a special time to respond, or they have a special time to resolve. So you're going to be able to do that now in a way that you wouldn't before. And then another thing we can do is we can set SLOs based on a business service in Service Manager, so that we can start to distinguish service levels by application or by business service. If we've got some very, very important business applications and we want to provide a higher level of service for those, we could do that. So there's a lot more flexibility here. I guess one of the questions I have for the group is how many folks actually have SLOs, actually have real SLOs, what I'll call real SLOs today. We have some customers who have SLOs, at least in theory. They're trying to work to certain targets, but they haven't necessarily committed. So just maybe in the chat window, if you could give us an idea of who's actually managing 2 SLOs today.
Yeah, the other thing you do is use the stamp tool at the lower left-hand corner of your window. It has like an arrow blue that points to the right, and maybe use an X if they don't, the red X, or the drop down for the green check if you do.
Okay, so we've got some priority-based SLOs. Yeah, I mean, we tend to encourage our customers to configure SLOs even if they haven't necessarily agreed on service levels with their customers. We think that it's a good idea to have some targets in place to try to start to manage to something. You don't have to have these agreed with customers in order to configure them. You can certainly use them as internal tools. And I think it's a good idea just to start getting an idea of how quickly you're responding to things, how quickly you're assigning things, how quickly you're resolving things. So I just think it's a good discipline to have, even if you're not necessarily going to take it to the level of communicating to your user community that yes, if this is a priority 3 incident, or if this is a medium priority service request, our commitment to you is that we will respond in X amount of time, or we'll resolve or complete it in Y amount of time.
So we have someone in the chat window saying that they're working on a process for their SLOs, but they don't have them yet. So.
Okay, good. So, just some considerations. Nick, why don't you talk to this? Because I think you were starting to say earlier about the fact that the SLOs, they're going to appear, but they're not going to appear immediately.
Yeah, there's a couple of considerations. So, Service Manager uses a workflow it runs in the background to apply these SLOs. It kind of monitors for incidents and service requests, and when something meets the right criteria, it'll apply the SLO. But it can take a few minutes in order for that process to happen. So this is a consideration, and this is fairly important to some folks. So, when you're creating an incident and you click Apply to save the record, you're not going to immediately get the service level information. It'll take a minute for that to appear. Now, once it appears, your compliance with that SLA will be real time. The date checking will be occurring in real time, but the actual application of the SLO the first time isn't going to be immediate. So the other point there, if any of you have ever worked in Service Manager, you may run into an issue with the form lockout. And what happens is if I've got a particular incident open, and Pete opens up that incident and also starts working on it, if one of us saves that record, it locks the other person out. And this happens when two people are working on the same record, but this also happens if you're working on a record and the system works on it at the same time. So if I create an incident and I click the apply button and I wait long enough for that service level objective to get applied to the incident, that'll actually lock me out of the incident because, you know, technically the workflow account went in and made a change while I had it open. So, you know, as a workaround there, I think the best sort of procedural control to that is to just let people know not to work with incidents until a service level has been applied, or service request. You know, it's the same on both work items. You really do want to wait until the SLO appears, and it does only take a few minutes, you know, at max, in order for that data to appear. But it's best to wait for that because you could spend some time filling out the incident form only to find out that you have to fill it out again because the service level objective got applied. Now that only happens after you've clicked apply the first time. If you create a new incident or a new service request, you can fill everything out at that point and then click OK when you're done. If the record's already been saved and you try to edit it before the service level appears, you may run into an issue. There's a question in the chat, how do you know it's locked? You won't know until you go to save the record, and then it'll tell you, it'll give you an error message, something along the lines of this incident or this service request has already been modified by another user, and it'll force you to close your changes. So since there's no proactive notification of it, that's why it's best to just wait for those objectives to be applied before you make your own changes. We talked a little bit about configuration finesse for the 24/7 and extended business hours. You know, you lose 1 second a day for the 24/7 clock, which is hopefully okay, but you just configure it by saying Sunday through Saturday, midnight to 11:59:59 on each day. And the extended business hours, you just have to play with the time zone in order to get the times in. There's another question in the chat. Can you copy what you typed and paste later? You can, yeah. The form won't close until you hit cancel. So if you filled out a lot of information in like a description or maybe in the you know, a notes field or something in the service request, you do have an opportunity to get that data out. It won't just close the form on you. So you'll have access to that to review what you set and keep it in mind for when you close and then open back the record up and set that data again. We talked very briefly earlier, I think we just mentioned that you cannot pause a service level objective natively. Service levels have statuses. We can do some things to prevent a service level from being applied, but you cannot pause it so that it stops counting up minutes for any period of time. You know, the use case for this that folks ask for is like when an incident goes on a status of on hold or waiting for hardware or something like that, we don't want to tick the clock anymore because we purchased a piece of hardware and we're waiting for it to get in, and we shouldn't be docked time for that. And out of the box, there's no capability for that. With some extension and some customization, there's capability for that. We've seen a couple blog posts of folks who have done it in different ways, but it's not going to be so straightforward as if an incident is in a status of pending or a service request is on hold. It pauses the clock. It'll be a little additional effort there. And folks, you know, handle that a couple different ways. I'd say most of the time folks just adjust their service level definitions, again, since they tend to be internal targets. Now, obviously, you know, for folks where those are communicated or where they're contractual and they can incur penalties and things, that becomes more of an issue, and then the customization works justified there. But oftentimes it isn't a huge deal that they can't be paused. And then the last point here, queue design is important. You know, queues were not used all that extensively in Service Manager 2010. This is more of a consideration, I think, for folks who are upgrading from 2010. They weren't used, so it's a little bit of a change in that you have to now plan what queues you're going to have built. Queues, again, just to reiterate, are those groups of work items that we're going to apply service level objectives to. But that design becomes important, and you want to make sure that it's thorough and that you've designed them sort of holistically, that you're not just looking at one queue at a time. You want to make sure there is an overlap between your different groups of work items when possible. You know, I think we talked about a VIP service level objective where you've got a user or a configuration item which gets a more strict service level applied to it. You know, if you're not careful with your design, you may end up having lots of service levels assigned to that individual object. Like if it's an SLA for a VIP user and it's the CIO and he has an incident, we have to be careful because if we're not careful with our queue design, that incident could have both the standard service level objective applied to it as well as the VIP service level objective. So it just means that we have to be careful and thoughtful about designing those queues and make sure that we're taking a holistic 50,000-foot view of them, not just, you know, building them one at a time to make sure they work together.
All right, so that is the presentation. Again, this was kind of a broad brush, and hopefully it's given folks some ideas about service level objective configuration, how they can apply service level management in Service Manager 2012, and also maybe for those of you who are still thinking about service levels or undecided about how and why you might be able to implement them in Service Manager. So we're very happy to take questions now if anybody's got any further questions. You can feel free to type them in the chat window. I don't think it's too big a group. I think if you wanted to unmute and ask, you could probably do that too.
So I've got a question based on the last comment. There's no concept of supersedence when it comes to the objectives. In other words, if you've got, you know, a standard objective and then a VIP objective, there's no concept that you can say that this one supersedes this one?
No, it'll apply all of them. Now they're treated individually, so you know, each service level that applies to a work item isn't aware of any of the other service levels. So, you know, for instance, if we were just tracking resolution time on incidents, and I had a VIP, then I would have one service level line for the standard resolution time, and that might be something like, say, 40 hours. And then I'll have a second service level objective for the VIP time, which might be 20 hours. So there will be both, and they'll both go to warning and breach individually of each other. So now you can take care of that if you're just thoughtful with your queue design. You can make sure that your standard priority service levels don't apply to VIPs, and the VIP service levels only apply to VIPs, for instance, to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And one other thing to mention, it's somewhat related, is that, you know, because these run continually, what will end up happening is if something changes, and we keep coming back to priority, so let's say an incident goes from a priority of 3 to a priority of 2, the SLO is going to rerun, and if we've designed our queues properly, then the priority 3 SLO or SLOs are going to be canceled, and then the priority 2 SLOs will be activated. But there is, unfortunately, there is no concept of supersedence. Yeah, the XML configuration for the views, that would be probably a presentation itself, but we could take that offline, Mark, if you'd like. So Lauren asked about SLA management in 2010. In Service Manager 2010, you certainly didn't have this degree of service level management. You may not have seen at the very beginning of the presentation, we gave a very, very simple overview of service level management in Service Manager 2010, and it was basically just a 24/7 clock that would set a target end date on an incident. based on priority. I don't know that we've got a webinar on queue design specifically, but that's another thing we could, we could take up offline if you have some, some specific questions. And I'm sure Dave will be happy to supply you with. We do have a schedule of webinars, and Dave will make sure that you get that. And I'm sorry, Lauren, you loaded the beta code for Service Manager 2012?
No. Can you hear me?
I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. In 2010, out there on the forums, there was some beta code for SLO management, and we loaded that.
Oh, I know. That was a third-party add-on.
Yes.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, that was got you closer, but it was still somewhat rudimentary, as I recall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Certainly not been like what we will have in 2012.
We're working with a customer now who is upgrading from 2010 to 2012. They had done the same thing, and we've just ended up removing that add-on and just replacing it with native functionality in Service Manager 2012.
Good to hear that works. That was a concern.
It does. It does.
Good.